David Miller stared at the eviction notice in his trembling hands. 30 days. That's all he had left before his 3 kids would be on the streets. The single father of 3 had been struggling ever since his wife passed away from a long illness 2 years ago. The medical bills had eaten through their small savings, and his job at the local construction company barely covered the basics. His 8-year-old daughter Lily was getting too big for her shoes, but new ones cost money he didn't have. 6-year-old Tommy needed glasses, but the eye doctor wanted $200 up front. And little 3-year-old Rose kept asking when Mommy was coming home, breaking David's heart all over again each time. The apartment was small, and the heat barely worked, but it was home. Now even that was slipping away. David had been 2 months behind on rent, and Mr. Johnson, the landlord, had finally run out of patience. "I'm sorry, David," the old man had said, avoiding eye contact. "I've got bills too, you understand." That's when the phone call came. David was fixing a broken cabinet door with duct tape when his old flip phone rang. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Mr. Miller, this is attorney Robert Hayes. I'm calling about your great-uncle, Walter's estate." Great-uncle Walter? David had to think for a moment. He barely remembered the old man. Maybe saw him twice at family reunions when he was a kid. Walter lived somewhere up in the mountains and never talked to anyone in the family. David's mom used to say Walter was different and left it at that. "I'm afraid Mr. Walter passed away last month," the lawyer continued. "According to his will, he's left you his property." David's heart jumped. Property? Maybe this was the answer to his prayers. Maybe there was a house he could sell or some land worth something. "What kind of property?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a pause. "Well, it's a cave, Mr. Miller. A limestone cave on about 40 acres in the mountains near Cedar Creek." A cave. David felt his heart sink back down to his boots. "A cave?" "Yes, sir. It's been in your family for generations. Your great-uncle was quite protective of it. There are some property taxes owed, about $800 annually. I need to know if you want to accept the inheritance or if you'd prefer to decline it." $800? David looked around his tiny apartment, at the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table, at his kids' worn-out clothes hanging on makeshift clotheslines. $800 might as well have been $8 million. But what choice did he have? Maybe he could sell the land for something. Anything was better than nothing. "I'll take it," he said. The following Saturday, David loaded his 3 kids into his 15-year-old pickup truck that coughed black smoke and made strange rattling sounds. The drive to Cedar Creek took 2 hours through winding mountain roads. The kids were excited about the adventure, pressing their noses to the windows and pointing at cows and horses in the fields. "Are we really going to see a cave, Daddy?" Lily asked, bouncing in her seat. "Is it like the ones in movies with treasure?" Tommy chimed in. Little Rose just clapped her hands and giggled, happy to be going somewhere new. David tried to share their excitement, but dread was growing in his stomach. What if the land was worthless? What if he couldn't even find someone to buy it? The property taxes alone would put him deeper in debt. Following the directions the lawyer had given him, David turned onto a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. The truck bumped and bounced over rocks and potholes. Trees pressed in on both sides, and David began to wonder if he'd taken a wrong turn. Finally, they reached a rusty mailbox with Walter Miller painted in faded letters. A narrow driveway led up a hill through thick woods. At the top sat a tiny, run-down cabin that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Windows were boarded up and the porch was sagging, but it was what lay behind the cabin that made David's heart sink completely. The cave entrance was nothing like the grand caverns he'd seen in pictures. It was just a dark hole in the hillside, maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall. Thick vines and thorny bushes had grown over most of the opening. Rocks and debris were piled up inside, making it look more like a dump than anything valuable. "This, is it?" Lily asked, her excitement fading. David parked the truck and got out slowly. The kids ran ahead but stopped when they saw how dark and uninviting the cave looked. Tommy picked up a stone and threw it into the darkness. They listened as it bounced and rolled somewhere deep inside. "It's scary," Rose whispered, taking David's hand. David knelt down next to his daughter and pulled all three kids close. "It's okay, sweetheart, we're just looking today." But inside, David was fighting back tears. This wasn't salvation. This was just another problem he couldn't afford to fix. The land was clearly worthless, too remote, too rocky, too wild for anyone to want. And the cave looked dangerous, like it might collapse at any moment. As they walked around the property, David tried to see some value in it. The trees were mostly scrub oak and pine, nothing valuable for timber. The land was too steep and rocky for farming or building. There wasn't even a decent road leading to it. They spent an hour exploring before heading back to town. The kids had found the adventure fun, but David could see the disappointment in their eyes too. This wasn't the treasure they'd hoped for either. On the drive home, they stopped at a small diner in Cedar Creek for lunch, one of the few treats David could still afford once in a while. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed the kids and struck up a conversation. "Y'all visiting someone up here?" she asked while pouring David's coffee. "We inherited some land," David said quietly. "The old Walter Miller place." The waitress's eyebrows shot up. "Old Walter's place, with that cave?" She chuckled and shook her head. "Honey, you inherited yourself a money pit. That crazy old man spent 50 years guarding that worthless hole in the ground like it was made of gold." Other customers at nearby tables had overheard and were turning around with amused expressions. "Walter's cave," laughed an old man in overalls. "Used to be teenagers would go up there to party until Walter started chasing them off with his shotgun. Harmless old coot, but paranoid as they come." "What's in the cave?" David asked, hoping maybe there was something he didn't know about. "Nothing but rocks and bat droppings," the waitress said. "Been explored plenty of times over the years. It's just a regular limestone cave. Nothing special about it except Walter thought it was his personal Fort Knox." The laughter in the diner made David's cheeks burn. He quickly paid the check and gathered his kids to leave. As they walked to the truck, he could hear the conversations continuing behind them. "Poor guy. Probably thought he hit the jackpot," someone said. "Reality's gonna hit him hard when he sees those property tax bills," added another voice. The drive home was quiet. The kids sensed their father's mood and kept to themselves, staring out the windows at the passing scenery. David's mind raced with calculations. $800 a year in taxes. Money he absolutely didn't have. Money that would keep him from buying his kids the things they needed. Maybe he should just let the county take the property for unpaid taxes. But something his great-uncle Walter had done stuck with him. If the old man had spent 50 years protecting a worthless cave, maybe there was something David was missing. Maybe Walter knew something the townspeople didn't. That night, after putting the kids to bed in their cramped apartment, David sat at his kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills. The math was simple and depressing. Without some kind of miracle, they'd be homeless in a month. The cave property was just another burden he couldn't carry. But as he looked at his sleeping children, Lily curled up with a stuffed animal that was missing an eye, Tommy with his broken glasses held together with tape, and little Rose sucking her thumb, David made a decision. He couldn't give up, not yet. Maybe the cave really was worthless. Maybe the whole town was right to laugh at him. But it was the only chance he had left. If there was even the smallest possibility that Great-Uncle Walter had seen something in that dark hole that others had missed, David owed it to his kids to find out. Tomorrow, he would go back to the cave. This time, he'd bring a flashlight and take a real look inside. What did he have to lose? He was already at rock bottom. Sometimes, David thought as he finally turned off the lights, the worst situations force you to take chances you'd never normally take. Maybe that old cave would turn out to be just another dead end. But maybe, just maybe, it would be the beginning of something better. He fell asleep that night with the first spark of hope he'd felt in months. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. The next Monday morning brought more bad news. David's boss at the construction company, Pete Rodriguez, called him into the small trailer that served as an office. Pete was a good man who'd kept David employed even when work was slow, but his expression was serious. "David, I hate to tell you this, but we're losing the Johnson contract. That's 3 jobs this month that fell through." Pete rubbed his weathered hands together nervously. I'm going to have to cut your hours down to 3 days a week, maybe less. David felt his stomach drop. 3 days a week meant maybe $200 if he was lucky. That wouldn't even cover groceries, let alone rent. Pete, I've got those kids. I know, son. I know. If anything opens up, you're first on my list. But right now, that's all I can do. David nodded and walked out of the trailer in a daze. Around him, his co-workers were loading tools and materials onto trucks, heading out to jobs he could no longer afford to lose. The morning sun felt cold on his face. At lunch break, instead of eating the peanut butter sandwich he'd packed, David drove to the Cedar Creek Diner. He needed to ask more questions about the cave, and maybe the locals would have different information when they weren't all laughing together. The same waitress from the weekend, whose name tag read Betty, recognized him immediately. Well, if it isn't the new owner of Walter's $1 million hole in the ground, she said with a grin that wasn't entirely mean-spirited. Betty, can I ask you something serious? David said, keeping his voice low. Did Walter ever say why that cave was so important to him? Betty's smile faded a bit. She looked around the diner, then leaned closer. Honey, Walter was different. Nice enough old man, don't get me wrong, but he had some strange ideas. Always talking about protecting what matters and keeping the secret safe. Most folks figured the isolation got to him. Secrets? Oh, you know how old mountain folk can be. Probably talking about old family stories or some nonsense like that. Walter's daddy and granddaddy lived up there too, going back generations. Sometimes these old families get funny ideas about their land being special. An older man at the counter turned around. David recognized him from the weekend, the one who'd made jokes about teenagers and Walter's shotgun. You still thinking about that cave, son? Maybe, David replied carefully. The man chuckled. Well, I'll tell you what I told my grandson when he wanted to go treasure hunting up there. That cave's been picked over by every kid in 3 counties for the past 50 years. If there was anything valuable in there, it would have been found by now. What about selling the land? David asked. Betty shook her head. Honey, I've lived here my whole life. That land's been in your family forever and nobody's ever wanted it. Too far from everything, too rocky to build on, and that cave makes it a liability. Who wants to buy property with a dangerous hole in the ground? David's last hope for a quick sale disappeared. He thanked Betty, left a small tip he couldn't afford, and drove home with a heavy heart. The afternoon stretched ahead of him with no work and no income. When he picked up his kids from the neighbor who watched them after school, Mrs. Patterson pulled him aside. She was a retired teacher who'd been incredibly kind, watching the children for free because she knew David's situation. David, I need to talk to you about little Rose, she said gently. She's been asking about her mother a lot lately, and Lily mentioned that you all might have to move soon. David's throat tightened. He'd tried so hard to keep the worst of their problems away from the kids, but they were smart. They noticed things. We're going through a rough patch, he admitted. I know, honey. I know. Mrs. Patterson patted his arm. Listen, I've been thinking. My son lives in Atlanta, and he's always looking for good construction workers. The pay's better there and there's more steady work. Maybe I can't afford to move, David said quietly. And the kids, this is the only home they remember with their mother. Mrs. Patterson nodded with understanding. Well, the offer's there if you need it. But David, you know I care about those babies. If things get too hard. She didn't finish the sentence, but David understood. Mrs. Patterson was gently offering to help with the children if David couldn't manage anymore. The kindness in her offer made his eyes water, but it also terrified him. He was coming dangerously close to losing everything that mattered. That evening, David sat at his computer in the local library while the kids did homework nearby. He'd been researching caves, hoping to find something, anything, that might give him a clue about Walter's property. Most of what he found was discouraging. Limestone caves were common throughout the region. Unless they had rare formations, historical significance, or commercial potential for tours, they were typically worthless. Cave-ins and liability issues made them more of a problem than an asset for property owners. But then he found something interesting. An article about a cave system in Kentucky that had been worthless for decades until archaeologists discovered Native American artifacts inside. The discovery had transformed the property into a protected historical site, bringing in research money and making the owner financially secure. David's pulse quickened. Could Walter's cave have something like that? Is that what the old man meant? By secrets and protecting what matters. The next morning, David used his day off to drive back to the cave property. This time he brought a heavy-duty flashlight he'd borrowed from Pete, along with some basic tools and a notepad. The cave entrance looked even less promising in the gray morning light. Vines and brush had grown thick over the opening, and the debris inside seemed to go back quite a ways. But David was determined to get a real look at what he'd inherited. He spent the first hour clearing away the worst of the brush and vines from the cave mouth. The work was hard, and thorns tore at his hands and arms. But as he worked, David noticed something odd. The debris blocking the cave wasn't random. Rocks were carefully placed, almost like someone had deliberately sealed off part of the entrance. Why would Walter do that? With the entrance cleared, David clicked on his flashlight and stepped inside. The cave was bigger than it looked from outside, maybe 15 feet wide and 10 feet tall. The floor was covered with loose rocks, old beer cans, and cigarette butts from years of teenage visitors. David moved deeper into the cave, his flashlight beam dancing across limestone walls. The cave seemed to go straight back for about 50 feet before making a turn to the right. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead. Nothing special so far, just a regular cave like everyone had said. But when David reached the turn and shined his light around the corner, he stopped. Ew, cave continued, but this section was different. The walls were cleaner and the debris on the floor was limited to natural rockfall. It was almost like the back section of the cave had been protected somehow. More interesting, there seemed to be another turn ahead, leading deeper into the mountain. David checked his phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the mountains. He thought about his kids, probably having lunch at school right now. Lily always saved her apple for after she finished her sandwich. Tommy would be trading his chips for someone else's cookies. Rose would be taking her nap at Mrs. Patterson's house. They were depending on him to find a way out of their troubles. This cave might be a dead end, but it was the only lead he had. David took a deep breath and continued deeper into the mountain. As he walked, his flashlight picked up details he hadn't noticed before. The limestone walls had interesting patterns, some that almost looked like they could be markings or symbols. Probably just natural rock formations, but Walter had spent 50 years studying these walls. Maybe the old man had seen something everyone else had missed. The cave made another turn, then opened into a larger chamber. David's flashlight beam wasn't strong enough to illuminate the entire space, but he could see it was substantial. His footsteps echoed differently here, suggesting high ceilings. And that's when David noticed something that made his heart race. In one section of the wall, almost hidden behind a natural limestone pillar, his flashlight had caught what looked like carved lines. Not natural rock patterns, actual carved symbols. David moved closer, his hands shaking as he held the light steady. The markings were definitely man-made. They looked old, weathered, but deliberate. Some kind of symbols or pictures carved right into the cave wall. This wasn't just a worthless hole in the ground. Someone long ago had thought this cave was important enough to decorate, important enough to leave messages in stone. David spent another hour exploring, finding more carved sections and what looked like natural shelves where objects might once have been placed. By the time he emerged from the cave, his mind was racing. He drove home with a new sense of purpose. Maybe the townspeople were wrong. Maybe Walter hadn't been a crazy old man protecting nothing. Maybe he'd been the guardian of something genuinely valuable. That evening, David called the local community college and asked to speak with someone in their history department. If these cave markings were what he thought they might be, he needed expert help to understand what he'd found. For the first time in months, David Miller went to sleep with hope instead of dread. His kids were still sleeping in a cramped apartment. The eviction notice was still taped to his refrigerator. His job was still hanging by a thread. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the community college's history department sounded skeptical over the phone. Mr. Miller, I appreciate you calling, but cave markings are usually just graffiti from visitors over the years. Even old graffiti can look mysterious. In flashlight beams. These look different, David insisted, really different. Could you maybe take a look? There was a pause. I suppose I could drive up there this weekend. But I should warn you, I've looked at dozens of these discoveries over the years. 99% of the time, it's nothing special. David's heart sank a little, but he pressed on. What about the other 1%? Well, Dr. Walsh said slowly, occasionally we do find something interesting. But Mr. Miller, please don't get your hopes up. That Friday afternoon, David met Dr. Walsh at the cave entrance. She was a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She carried a large bag filled with professional equipment, better flashlights, measuring tools, and a camera with a big lens. This is the cave? She asked, looking at the overgrown entrance with obvious disappointment. It looks better inside, David said hopefully. Dr. Walsh sighed and pulled on a hard hat. All right, let's have a look. They made their way through the outer cave sections, Dr. Walsh's powerful LED lights making everything much clearer than David's borrowed flashlight. She examined the walls carefully but said nothing. When they reached the first carved markings David had found, Dr. Walsh stopped walking. Hold this light, she said, handing David one of her flashlights. She pulled out a magnifying glass and moved closer to the wall. For several minutes she studied the markings in complete silence. David could hear water dripping somewhere deeper in the cave and the sound of his own nervous breathing. Finally, Dr. Walsh straightened up. Her expression had completely changed. Mr. Miller, these are not graffiti. David's heart jumped. What are they? I'm not certain, but they appear to be petroglyphs, rock carvings, and if I'm right about the style, they could be quite old. She was already taking pictures, the camera flash lighting up the cave walls like lightning. How old? Possibly several hundred years, maybe more. Dr. Walsh was now examining the carvings with intense focus. These symbols, they look Native American, possibly Cherokee, though I'd need an expert to confirm that. They spent the next 2 hours exploring deeper into the cave system. David had only seen a small portion during his first visit. The cave went much further back than he'd realized, opening into multiple chambers connected by narrow passages, and almost every chamber had more markings. In the largest chamber, Dr. Walsh's lights revealed an entire wall covered in carved symbols. Animals, geometric patterns, and human figures that seemed to tell some kind of story. But what made her gasp out loud was what she found on natural stone shelves along the walls. Pottery. Old pottery, sitting exactly where someone had placed it centuries ago. My God, Dr. Walsh whispered, her voice echoing in the chamber. This isn't just a few random carvings. This is a significant archaeological site. She carefully photographed the pottery without touching it, explaining to David that disturbing artifacts could damage their scientific value. These vessels appear to be intact. That's extremely rare. Most Native American artifacts from this region have been damaged or removed long ago. In another chamber, they found what looked like stone tools arranged on a natural rock altar. In a third chamber, David's light caught something that made Dr. Walsh actually grab his arm. Do you see that? She pointed to a section of wall where the limestone had natural colors, reds and yellows and blacks. David looked closer. The colored stone had been carved and shaped to create what looked like a painted scene. Figures dancing around a fire, animals running through forests, and symbols that seemed to represent the sun and moon. This is prehistoric art, Dr. Walsh said, her voice filled with awe. David, this could be one of the most important archaeological discoveries in this region in decades. As they prepared to leave the cave, Dr. Walsh explained what would happen. Next, I need to contact colleagues who specialize in Native American archaeology. This site needs to be properly documented and studied, but David, she paused, you need to understand that this changes everything about your property. Changes it how? If this site is as significant as I believe it might be, it could be eligible for historical protection status. That would mean you couldn't develop the land, but it also means there could be substantial compensation through various programs. Universities pay for access to sites like this. The state has grants for preservation, and if this becomes a recognized historical site. Dr. Walsh didn't finish the sentence, but David understood. His worthless cave might actually be worth something. That weekend, David couldn't focus on anything else. He tried to act normal around his kids, but his mind kept racing with possibilities. What if the cave really was valuable? What if Walter had been protecting something genuinely important all these years? On Monday morning, Dr. Walsh called with news that made David's hands shake as he held the phone. David, I've sent the photos to Dr. Robert Thunder, who's one of the country's leading experts on southeastern Native American sites. He wants to see the cave immediately. He's driving up from the University of Tennessee tomorrow. What does that mean? It means your cave might be even more important than I thought. The next day, David took off work, time he couldn't afford to lose, to meet Dr. Thunder at the cave site. The professor was a tall man with long gray hair and kind eyes who introduced himself as being part Cherokee himself. Dr. Walsh's photos are remarkable, he told David as they prepared to enter the cave. But I need to see this site in person to make any definitive assessments. Dr. Thunder moved through the cave differently than Dr. Walsh had. He seemed to understand something about the layout, stopping at specific spots and studying the arrangement of the chambers. In the main chamber, with the painted walls, he spent nearly an hour in silent examination. Finally, he turned to David with an expression of deep respect. Mr. Miller, your family has been protecting one of the most intact Cherokee sacred sites I've ever encountered. This appears to be a ceremonial cave system that was used for hundreds of years. The artifacts, the petroglyphs, the painted chambers, they tell the story of a people who considered this place holy. David felt a chill run down his spine. Sacred? Very much so. The arrangement of these chambers, the types of symbols, the preservation of ceremonial objects. This was clearly a place of great spiritual importance. And somehow, miraculously, it survived intact. Dr. Thunder explained that most sites like this had been destroyed or looted long ago. The fact that Walter's family had protected it for generations was extraordinary. Your great-uncle wasn't just guarding a cave, Dr. Thunder said. He was guarding a piece of living history, a connection to the people who lived on this land for thousands of years before European settlement. Over the following weeks, more experts visited the cave. Each one confirmed what Dr. Thunder had said. This was a discovery of major historical importance. The state archaeologist came. Representatives from the Cherokee Nation made the drive from Oklahoma to see the site their ancestors had held sacred. And each expert brought the same message. David Miller wasn't just the owner of worthless mountain property anymore. He was the guardian of an irreplaceable piece of American history. The Cherokee representatives, led by a woman named Patricia Crow Feather, spent an entire day in the cave with David. She explained how sites like this had been used by her ancestors for ceremonies marking the changing seasons, coming-of-age rituals, and spiritual healing. Your family has done a great service, she told David as they stood in the main chamber. Many of our sacred sites have been lost or destroyed. This one survived because people like your great-uncle understood its value. But I had no idea, David said. I almost let the county take it for unpaid taxes. Patricia smiled gently. Sometimes we protect important things without fully understanding why. Your great-uncle felt the responsibility of guardianship. Now that responsibility passes to you. That evening, as David drove home, his phone rang. It was Dr. Walsh, and her voice was excited. David, I've been making calls all day. The National Archaeological Foundation wants to fund a complete study of your cave. We're talking about a 3-year research project with significant compensation for site access. And the Cherokee Nation has indicated they'd like to discuss a long-term preservation partnership. David pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking too much to drive safely. What kind of compensation? He asked. Well, nothing's final yet, but we're looking at potentially $50,000 just for the initial research access. And if the site qualifies for historical protection status, which I'm confident it will, there are ongoing payments for preservation maintenance, $50,000. David tried to wrap his mind around the number. It was more money than he'd ever had at one time in his entire life. But as he sat in his old truck on the side of the mountain road, David realized something important had changed inside him. A month ago, $50,000 would have seemed like all the money in the world. Now, knowing what the cave really was, the money felt secondary. 3 weeks after Dr. Thunder's visit, David's phone rang at 6 in the morning. He fumbled for it in the dark, worried something was wrong. "David, this is Dr. Walsh. I'm sorry to call so early, but I have incredible news." The carbon dating results came back from the pottery samples. David sat up in bed, instantly awake. And? David, some of those artifacts are over 800 years old. 800 years. This site has been in continuous use by Native American peoples since before Columbus ever reached the Americas. The full weight of what Dr. Walsh was saying hit David like a truck. His cave wasn't just historically important, it was ancient. It was a place where people had been coming to worship and hold ceremonies for nearly a millennium. But that's not even the biggest news, Dr. Walsh continued. The Cherokee Nation has officially requested that this site be nominated for National Historic Landmark status, and the Smithsonian Institution wants to send a team to document everything. The Smithsonian. David had seen their museums on television, but never imagined he'd have any connection to such a famous institution. What does all this mean? It means your cave is being recognized as one of the most significant intact Native American sacred sites in the southeastern United States. David, this is going to change everything. Over the next few days, David's quiet mountain property became a hub of activity. Researchers arrived with vans full of equipment. Professional photographers documented every chamber of the cave system. Specialists in Native American culture studied the petroglyphs and painted walls, interpreting stories that had been told in stone centuries ago. Dr. Thunder returned with a team from the Cherokee Nation, including tribal elders who performed a blessing ceremony at the cave entrance. David was invited to participate, and as he stood in a circle with people whose ancestors had considered this place sacred, he felt a connection to something much larger than himself. This cave was a place of healing, explained Elder Patricia, Crow Feather, after the ceremony. The symbols on the walls tell stories of spiritual journeys, of young people becoming adults, of communities gathering to seek guidance from the spirit world. Your great-uncle was protecting not just artifacts, but the spiritual heart of our people's presence in this land. Meanwhile, the practical implications of the discovery were becoming clear. The National Archaeological Foundation approved a comprehensive 3-year study of the site, with David receiving $65,000 in initial compensation, more than twice his previous annual income. But the financial windfall was just the beginning. The Cherokee Nation offered to purchase a conservation easement on the land for $120,000, ensuring the site would be permanently protected while allowing David to retain ownership. The state of Tennessee approved a historical preservation grant that would provide $15,000 annually for site maintenance and security. Most unexpectedly, a documentary film company contacted David about creating a feature-length film about the discovery. They offered $75,000 for exclusive filming rights, with additional payments if the documentary was picked up by major networks. Within a month of Dr. Thunder's initial visit, David had gone from facing eviction to having more money than he'd ever imagined possible. But as he sat in his apartment one evening, looking at bank statements that seemed surreal, David realized the real value of Walter's legacy went beyond money. The discovery had connected him to a community of people who understood the cave's true significance. Cherokee Nation members visited regularly, not as tourists, but as people returning to a sacred place their families had been separated from for generations. Dr. Thunder introduced David to other families who had similar responsibilities, people who had inherited or discovered important historical sites and chosen to protect them rather than exploit them. These weren't wealthy people, but they shared a sense of purpose that David had never experienced before. One evening, Patricia Crow Feather brought her granddaughter, a teenager named Hope, to visit the cave. As they emerged from the underground chambers, Hope turned to David with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Miller, my great-great-grandmother used to tell stories about a sacred cave in these mountains where her people held ceremonies. I never thought I'd actually see it. Thank you for keeping it safe." David realized that Walter's protection of the cave had preserved not just artifacts and paintings, but living connections between modern Cherokee families and their ancestral homeland. The media attention brought unexpected challenges. Reporters wanted to tell David's story as a rags-to-riches tale, but he found himself more interested in talking about the cave's cultural significance than his personal financial windfall. "This isn't really about me getting rich," he told a journalist from the regional newspaper. "It's about understanding that my family was trusted with something sacred. My great-uncle Walter knew this was important even when nobody else did. Now I understand why he spent his whole life protecting it." The article ran with the headline, "Widowed Father Inherits Sacred Cave, Becomes Guardian of Ancient History." Within days, David received calls from universities across the country, from other Cherokee communities, and from families who had similar stories of ancestors protecting mysterious family properties. But the most meaningful call came from someone David never expected to hear from. "Mr. Miller, this is Walter's neighbor, Frank Peterson. I live about 2 miles down the mountain from your great-uncle's old place." David remembered the name from property documents but had never met Frank. "Hello, Mr. Peterson. I wanted to call because I owe you and Walter an apology. See, I thought your great-uncle was just a crazy old hermit, but after reading about your cave in the newspaper, I realized Walter tried to tell me about its importance years ago. I just didn't listen." Frank explained that Walter had approached him several times over the decades, trying to share the responsibility of protecting the cave site. "He told me there were sacred things up there that needed guardians. I thought he was talking nonsense. Now I understand he was trying to find someone to help carry the burden." "He never talked to my family about it," David said. "Walter said your family had forgotten their responsibility. He'd been waiting years for someone from your bloodline to come back and claim their heritage. When you inherited the property, Walter's lawyer told me the old man said it was finally going back to the right hands." David felt a chill. Walter had known. Somehow the old man had known that David would be the one to recognize the cave's true value and accept the responsibility of protecting it. That weekend, David brought his kids to see the cave for the first time since his initial discovery. They were amazed by the transformation. What had once looked like a scary hole in the ground now had a proper entrance walkway, professional lighting for the research teams, and interpretive signs explaining the site's significance. "Daddy, people really lived here hundreds of years ago?" Lily asked, running her fingers along the stone walls. "Not lived here exactly," David explained, "but they came here for special ceremonies. This was a holy place for them." Tommy was fascinated by the painted walls. "Did they make these pictures to tell stories?" "That's exactly what they did. These walls are like ancient books, telling stories about their people and their beliefs." Even 3-year-old Rose seemed to sense something special about the cave. She was usually hyperactive and loud, but inside the underground chambers, she became quiet and thoughtful, staying close to David's side. As they explored the cave together, David realized his children were now part of this legacy too. Someday they would be the guardians of this sacred place. The responsibility would pass from Walter to David to his kids, ensuring the site remained protected for future generations. That evening, Dr. Walsh called with the news David had been hoping for but hardly dared expect. "David, it's official. The Department of Interior has approved the National Historic Landmark designation for your cave site. You're now the owner of one of America's officially recognized most important historical locations." National Historic Landmark status came with significant benefits: federal grants for preservation, ongoing research funding, and most importantly, permanent protection from development or damage. But it also came with something David valued even more: recognition that Walter hadn't been crazy or paranoid. The old man had been right all along. The cave was sacred. It was important. It deserved protection. A month later, David stood at Walter's grave in the small mountain cemetery, holding a letter that had arrived that morning. The Cherokee Nation had voted to honor Walter posthumously as a keeper of sacred places, recognizing his decades of protecting their ancestral site. "You did it, Walter," David said quietly to the simple headstone. "You kept it safe until the right time came." The poor widowed father who had inherited what everyone thought was a worthless cave had become the guardian of one of America's most important Native American sacred sites. But more than that, he'd become part of a story much larger than himself, a story of protection, respect, and the connection between past and present. As David walked back to his truck, he thought about the townspeople who had laughed at him just a few months earlier. Tomorrow, 6 months after David's first phone call from Walter's lawyer, he stood in the lobby of the First National Bank of Cedar Creek, waiting to meet with the bank president, the same bank that had refused to extend his car loan just 7 months earlier was now eager to discuss his investment opportunities. The transformation had been remarkable and swift. David's total compensation from various sources, research grants, conservation easements, documentary rights, and preservation funds, had reached nearly $400,000. More importantly, the ongoing annual payments for site maintenance, research access, and historical preservation would provide a steady income of over $60,000 a year. But the changes went far beyond David's personal finances. Cedar Creek, the small mountain town that had been slowly dying as young people moved away for better opportunities, was experiencing an unexpected renaissance. The designation of David's Cave as a National Historic Landmark had brought attention from across the country. The Cherokee Nation established a cultural center in town, bringing jobs and tourism. The State Tourism Board included Cedar Creek on its heritage trail maps. Historians and archaeology students made regular trips to study the sacred site. Betty, the diner waitress who had joked about David's $1 million hole in the ground, was now working double shifts to serve all the visitors. The old diner had been renovated and expanded, and Betty had been promoted to manager. "I owe you an apology," she told David one morning as he stopped in for coffee. "And I owe one to old Walter, too. Turns out he really was sitting on something valuable all along." David smiled, remembering how her laughter had stung just months earlier. Walter would have liked seeing the town busy again. He used to talk about how Cedar Creek was dying. Well, it's sure alive now. We've got a waiting list for rental properties, and the Morrison family is talking about opening a bed and breakfast. The Morrison family. David remembered Betty Morrison, the real estate agent who had laughed at the idea of selling Walter's worthless property. She had called him 2 weeks earlier, asking if he'd be interested in selling additional family land for tourism development. The irony wasn't lost on David. More satisfying than any personal vindication was seeing how the discovery had benefited the Cherokee Nation. Families who had been separated from their ancestral homeland for generations were now making pilgrimages to the sacred cave. The tribal council had established a youth program that brought Cherokee teenagers to the site to learn about their heritage. Elder Patricia Crowfeather had become a regular visitor, often bringing groups of tribal members to hold ceremonies in the cave. "This place was sleeping for too long," she told David during one visit. "Walter kept it safe while it slept. Now you're helping it wake up and serve its purpose again." The documentary about the cave's discovery had been picked up by the National Geographic Channel and was scheduled to air in prime time. David had used some of his windfall to take his kids to Washington, D.C., where they saw artifacts from their family's cave displayed in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Standing in that vast museum, looking at pottery and carved stones that had come from their mountain property, David's children finally understood the magnitude of what they'd inherited. "We're famous, aren't we, Daddy?" Lily had asked, reading the display placard that mentioned their family name. "Not famous," David replied. "We're guardians. That's much more important." The kids' lives had changed dramatically, but in ways David was careful to keep grounded. They'd moved out of their cramped apartment into a comfortable house in town. Nothing extravagant, but a real home with enough bedrooms and a backyard where Rose could play. Tommy had gotten his new glasses and was excelling in school. Lily was taking art classes and had developed a fascination with Native American culture. Little Rose was thriving in a good daycare program, while David managed his new responsibilities as the cave site's guardian. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in David himself. The desperate, hopeless man who had inherited what seemed like another burden had discovered a sense of purpose he'd never known before. David now split his time between overseeing the cave site, coordinating with researchers and Cherokee Nation representatives, and speaking at conferences about historical preservation. Universities invited him to share his story with students studying archaeology and cultural preservation. "I'm not an expert," he would tell these audiences. "I'm just someone who learned to listen to what my great-uncle was trying to protect. Sometimes the most valuable things look worthless until you understand their real significance." The speaking engagements brought additional income, but more importantly, they connected David with other people who had similar stories. He'd met families across the country who had protected old buildings, preserved traditional knowledge, or maintained historical sites without fully understanding their importance until experts recognized their value. 1 year after Walter's death, David organized a memorial service at the cave site. The entire Cherokee Nation Council attended, along with researchers who had studied the site, townspeople from Cedar Creek, and David's construction crew buddies who had watched his transformation with amazement. Pete Rodriguez, David's old boss, approached him after the ceremony. "David, I've got to ask, did you know? When you inherited that cave, did you have any idea what it really was?" David thought about the question seriously. "No, I didn't know about the artifacts or the history. But Pete, there was something about the way Walter had protected it, the way he'd spent his whole life guarding it. I guess I decided to trust that he knew something I didn't. And if it had turned out to be worthless after all?" David looked at his children playing with Cherokee kids near the cave entrance, all of them learning traditional games from Elder Patricia. "Then at least I would have tried. Sometimes that's all you can do. Trust that the people who came before you had good reasons for their choices." The anniversary celebration concluded with a traditional Cherokee blessing ceremony. As David stood with his children in the circle of tribal elders, listening to ancient prayers echoing off limestone walls that had heard similar words for 8 centuries, he felt the presence of all the guardians who had come before him. Walter was there in spirit, along with all the generations of Cherokee people who had held this place sacred, and all the Miller family members who had somehow kept the property in their bloodline until the right moment arrived. Later that evening, after all the visitors had gone home, David sat alone at the cave entrance watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Thunder. "The next phase of research funding has been approved. Another 3 years, another 150,000. Congratulations, Guardian." David smiled and put the phone away. The money was wonderful, and his family's future was now secure in ways he'd never imagined possible. But the real treasure wasn't the financial windfall. The real treasure was understanding that he was part of something larger than himself, a chain of guardianship that stretched back centuries and would continue long after he was gone. His children would someday pass this responsibility to their children, ensuring that the sacred cave remained protected for future generations. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, David thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a desperate man facing eviction, inheriting what everyone thought was a worthless burden. The entire town had laughed at the poor, widowed father who'd been left with nothing but a hole in the ground. But sometimes, David reflected, what looks like the end of your luck is really just the beginning of a story you never could have imagined. Sometimes the things that seem worthless contain treasures you can't see until you're ready to understand their true value. The poor widowed father who had inherited a cave had indeed had the last laugh. But more than that, he'd found his purpose, secured his family's future, and become the guardian of something sacred that would outlast them all. As David walked back to his truck, he paused to look at the modest plaque that had been installed near the cave entrance. Miller Family Sacred Cave Site, National Historic Landmark. Protected in perpetuity through the guardianship of the Miller family and the Cherokee Nation. In memory of Walter Miller, 1941-2024, keeper of sacred places. The crazy old hermit who had spent 50 years protecting a worthless cave was now officially recognized as the guardian of one of America's most important historical sites. And David Miller, the construction worker who had almost lost everything, was now carrying on that sacred trust. Sometimes the best treasures are the ones that choose you, rather than the ones you go looking for. And sometimes, the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the responsibility to protect something precious for future generations. As David drove home to his children, he thought about Walter and smiled. The old man had known exactly what he was doing when he left the cave to his great-nephew. He'd been waiting for someone who would understand that true wealth isn't about what you can take from the world, but about what you can give back to it.